Hi, Valerie Dawn here. Today I'm excited to share this striking scrappy quilt project that's made with easy blocks but looks so much more difficult. This is the Starlight Crossings quilt. You'll be amazed at how simple it is to piece together. And the best part? It's perfect for using up those fabric bits from other projects. You know, the ones that are too small to keep but too precious to toss. Let's get started. For a bold and dramatic look, I've chosen 14 dark value colors that span the color wheel. These are fat quarters, but any scraps larger than 2.5 by 2.5 will work perfectly. This quilt is also jelly roll friendly because I'm going to cut these fabrics into 2.5 by 22-inch strips to make the 4 patch squares. You'll also need 1.5 yards of white background fabric and 4 yards of black or really dark background fabric. And this is where it gets fun. This intricate quilt design is actually just 2 of the simplest blocks, 4 patch and the square and square. I like to break projects down into parts because each completed step brings its own moment of contentment. For this project, we just need simple quilting tools, a cutting mat, a ruler, and a rotary cutter. Start by cutting 2.5-inch strips of each of your colorful fabrics, and you need a variety of these for the 4 patch squares. And then we match them up in random pairs, place them right sides together, and make up a number of these random collections. And also you need some that have a dark patch and a white patch. Bring them to your sewing machine. Make sure you've got them right sides together because I have made those mistakes more often than not. And then stitch a 1/4-inch seam. Make sure you stitch a nice variety of the dark and white patches. You don't need as many of those because they are only needed for the inside of the star blocks. I like to press the seams and then open them and just press toward one of the fabrics. It doesn't really matter which one, just give it a nice steam press all the way along. Now line up the strips nice and even on your mat, cut the selvage off, and then cut it in 2.5-inch pieces. Make sure they're all even and the same width. These are going to be 1/2 of the 4 patch. And you do that with all of the variety of strips that you've made so that you end up with all kinds of variety of these patches. Then you take each one and randomly match them. Mix them up so that they're as scrappy as you can make them. Look how the seams, you just turn them so that they're opposite seam pressed direction. And also you need to do that with the white patches. So you match up one piece that has a white patch with a piece that has the 2 dark patches. These are so easy now. You just place all of your patches together, make the seams so that they lock together in opposite directions, and then just do your 1/4-inch seam. And make sure, you get them mixed up as much as possible so you have a really nice variety of patches. And just start stitching. Now I like to place it so that seam is going in the same direction I'm sewing. That means the seam on the bottom is in the opposite direction, but just make sure it doesn't get curled under. Sometimes that'll happen, and then I don't like that. I usually get out my seam ripper and pick it out. So just make sure that you get the seams laying flat on both the top and the bottom. lay out all your random patches so that you can see what you have. Doesn't this look great? And we have the patches with white. Press them to one side, and it doesn't matter which side. For the square and square blocks, we need 2.5-inch strips of the black, and we're going to cut these into 2.5-inch squares. These are our corner blocks. Then we cut 4.5-inch strips of the white and cut them again so that we have 4.5-inch squares. I like to use chalk on dark fabrics. Just flip them over and on the wrong side, draw a chalk line that's corner to corner diagonally. This is going to be our stitching line. And just mark each one with a bit of chalk, just like that. Then make sure you get the right side up. It can be really tricky to see which side is the right side on these white fabrics. Place your dark patch right sides together in one corner, and then take them to your sewing machine and stitch them corner to corner on that diagonal line, and just chain them all together like this until you have them all stitched. If you've watched my other videos, and I hope you have, you'll note that I don't usually like to waste fabric. But in this quilt, I'm prioritizing simplicity and speed over fabric. So you'll see what we do is trim those edges to a 1/4-inch seam and then press that corner open. Place the other corners and start stitching again. And that will give you, once you have these done, you're going to have a batch of what we're going to call half square and square blocks. Trim the corners off the same as the other ones. Leave a 1/4-inch on the good side of the seam. And press that open too. These will be our half square and square blocks. And then you just continue with as many blocks as you need for the full square and square. This is where it starts to get really fun. This is where we bring all of our 4-patch, square and square, and half square and square together to make the main blocks of this quilt. So pick a 4-patch, put it in the center, surrounded by 4 of these square and square blocks, and then you use the 4-patch that have the white corners, and make sure you place the white corners facing in, and that's going to give us this really lovely star pattern. And these are so much fun. Once you get them laid out, you can rearrange some of the patches if you don't like how the colors are going together, or if some of them are kind of too close together, just switch them around and till you're happy. Keep them all laid out in the right order so that you don't get them mixed up, and just start stitching these together in rows. I try to line the point of the square and square up with the center of the seam of the 4-patch, and then just stitch that 1/4-inch seam. I like to use my seam ripper when I go over those intersections, just to keep everything lying flat and it doesn't bunch up. And just stitch all the way to the end of each patch. And then just work along the rows until you have all of the patches stitched, 1/4-inch seams. Press the seams toward the 4-patch and then the square and square will lie flat on the corners. And we're going to do that on all 3 rows. The middle row, the 4 and 4 patches in the center, so it's going to be pressed the opposite direction of the other 2 rows. And then when we match them together to stitch them, the seams will come together. See, they lock together. We always try and get these to lock together. They lay flat, and it makes it easier when you quilt, you know, when you do the quilt sandwich, that you won't have a big lump of seams in the way. And just stitch all these rows together. Make sure you get everything in the right direction. The other thing I like to do is, wherever possible, stitch with the square and square facing you, so you can make sure that you don't stitch over the point and bury the point. That's another little fussy thing that is nice to have in your quilts, is that you have all these nice sharp points showing. The last step of this lovely star block is just to press these seams, and I usually press them to the outside, right along each seam. Bit of steam helps, and then do that on the other side of the block. And there, that's so easy. That looks really difficult, and it was just made with those 2 simple patches, the square and square and the 4 patch. The next block is our alternate blocks, and we are going to do the same thing. It takes 5 of the 4 patches that are all dark and 4 of the half square and square. I'm not sure what else to call them. They're not a full square and square. I don't think they have any other official name. It's just half square and square. Lay those out, stitch them together, same as we did with the star block. These are the sash blocks. These are the ones that go in between the full blocks. And make sure that you get the V point pointing toward the 4 patch. Find a nice flat space, and maybe you have a big table. I just lay this out on one of my beds, and place the quilt blocks in a nice pattern that you're happy with. You can rearrange the blocks so that you have the colors so that they're not, you know, close together. I'm going to pause my video here just for a moment because I made a big mistake on one of my blocks, and I want to see, can you pick it out? See if you can find it. It's right there. I stitched that row on the star block backwards, and I had to get out my seam ripper and pick out the stitches and turn it around properly. Don't get discouraged if you make mistakes like that. It happens to all of us, and that's why we have seam rippers. Just one more step before we move on to the Seminole border. We have this narrow black border in between the Starlight Crossings quilt inside and the Seminole border. And this is how we do it. We cut 2.5 inch strips, as many as we need to go around the full perimeter, and then we do a nice diagonal miter between all of the strips, and just press it open, and then we stitch it around all 4 edges of the quilt top. This border is easier than it looks. Cut 3 strips, 2 black, 1 white, that's 2.5 inches wide, and lay them side by side. Kind of looks like a skunk, doesn't it? Stitch the black and the white together, and then another black on the other side of the white with 1/4 inch seams, and then press both toward the black. Once you get all 3 strips stitched together and press toward the black pieces. Lay them evenly on your cutting board, trim off that selvage, and cut 2.5-inch pieces. And then we're just going to line them up diagonally and stitch them together. Cut as many as you can out of each strip. And you're going to need several strips to go all the way around the border. Stagger them in a diagonal line so that the corners of each one of the white blocks aligns with the next corner, like you see here. And then match them together, and since we pressed everything toward the black, the seams will lock together. Just start stitching, and you can stitch these together in batches, like two pairs of, just do pairs, press them open, and then stitch the next set together so that you have 2 and 2 that you stitch together. They go really fast and they're fun to make. Once you have a nice strip of these all stitched together, press them all in one direction. They're stretchy because they're on the bias, and so you don't want to stretch them out too much. Now again, I'm prioritizing simplicity and speed over fabric, so you use your quilting ruler. Make sure you have a 1/4-inch seam above the edge, the tip of the white blocks on each corner, and just trim the excess black fabric off. Lay it down next to your quilt edge. You need 15 white blocks for each edge, and the edge measures, mine is 48.25 inches. Now remember, this Seminole border is a little bit stretchy, so you should be able to fit it in nicely. And make sure you have the diagonal ends of the strip in opposite directions so it fits like this, because we're going to add that tip, we're going to add that strip to the edge. Okay, now take a really close look here. It's about 1.25 inches from the raw edge of the black border to the edge of that Seminole border. And once it's stitched, it's about 1.25 inches. And then we're going to place that strip of 5 blocks along the edge and stitch it. When you stitch the Seminole border on, stitch it facing the Seminole border itself, so you make sure you don't stitch over the white corners, the white points. Now bring the corner of the quilt up to your quilting mat, and we're going to trim this off nice and straight so we can stitch the corner of the border on. All right, let's place this up. See if it measures nicely, because see that corner there where the black and white come together and the other one on the other side, we want them to line up perfectly. This one turned out just right, so I'm just going to stitch that on. Let's trim one more of these. Cut it straight like we did the other one. And then match up the 5 blocks. Look, that doesn't match. That's off by 1/4 inch. These are pretty easy to fix. You just nip a little bit on one of those white blocks on either side. Just stitch the seam a little bit wider, like 1 millimeter on either side. It took me a few tries to figure out how to finish these Seminole border corners, but this is just right because it trims it up very nicely. And you can see where I adjusted the seams there, so it fit. And then we just have that last corner that we have to stitch in. And once we have that done, use your ruler and trim the dog ears so that you have 1/4 inch right in the black beyond the white square. That's what we'll stitch the outside border to. And that's that. Isn't that pretty? I love that. I like to exaggerate the corner blocks. This is another square and square. You just stitch these all the way around They were, I'll leave the dimensions in the pattern you can download. This is just a white square cut on the diagonal, stitch it on all four corners like square and square. All right, we are going to stitch this into the corner blocks of the quilt. I like to leave lots of extra around the outside edge because when you finish the quilt sandwich, this is going to be kind of ratty around the edge and you have to trim it off. And the other thing is we need to leave enough space here to stitch our binding on so it doesn't bury these corners. And so that's why I leave this extra. Now to trim this, I trim it properly on two edges. All right, there's a 45-degree angle. When I line that up, it just, by coincidence, gives me a 1/4 inch. Make sure you keep that 1/4 inch along the white edge. And just trim that. And the other side, again, you need, just make sure it's square. Leave a 1/4 inch of white for the seam. Trim that off. And it's up to you if you want to square the rest of it off. I do, I'm a bit, meticulous like that. So I'm just going to trim that off. So whenever you're stitching on the diagonal or on the bias, it stretches a little. And so I'm just going to trim those edges off. I've got about 1 inch of white around the outside edge. And now what I'm going to do with these is I'll stitch the black border on either side, and this is my corner. And my black border, I want to cut strips that are 6 3/4 inches wide. Here's the finished corner, along with the wide black border around the outside, all completed. This is the final product. Isn't it beautiful? I really hope you've enjoyed joining me to make this Starlight Crossings quilt today. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.